the Arab conquests are 630s and 640s, but the Persian War is 602 to 628.
Yes.
So what can be said about this, what seems to be a pretty costly war against Persians?
So the war was costly initially only for the Romans. The eastern provinces were conquered by Persia. That means Syria, Palestine, Egypt. So that's a loss.
Mm-hmm.
You lose all that revenue. And then they start raiding into Asia Minor.
Yes.
By the way, this is exactly what the Arabs would do, just a couple decades later. They would conquer Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and they would start raiding into Asia Minor. So almost like this phase of East Roman history begins already during the Persian invasion. It's just a kind of a prelude. It was, in fact, the Arabs that would do that for the next few centuries. So Heraclius, it takes him a very long time to get organized. In fact, something like 15 years. And it's not entirely clear what he's doing all this time. But he ultimately manages to defeat the Persians by waging these really spectacular, weird campaigns in the east. He decides to strike into the Persian heartland, as it were. Well, first in the Caucasus region, and then he goes into Mesopotamia. So not to try to defeat their armies that are rampaging around Asia Minor or even besieging his capital in 626. The Persians and the Avars, this nomadic warrior group that's settled in roughly modern Hungary. They're besieging Constantinople. Heraclius doesn't even go. And he's just kind of preparing his armies in the east. And he strikes the Persians right where it hurts. And this now begins to degrade the Persian heartland and their infrastructure. Because remember, both of these empires are going to be in shambles by the time the Arabs come along. And this is what enables the Arabs to conquer them so quickly. I mean, they've destroyed each other in these wars. And eventually Heraclius calls in his Turkish allies and they go on a field trip through Mesopotamia. And this causes a coup in Persia, and Khusro is killed.
Is there something to be said, a little bit of texture to the motivations of the different empires and the different groups involved? So the East Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, and the Islamic Caliphates, were they after conquering? Were they after expansion? Were they after more like raiding for financial benefits? What was the motivation?
So in the past, the Persian Shahs basically were interested in raiding. And they also had an interest in manpower. So all of those Mesopotamian agricultural estates won't till themselves. So they were kind of insatiable for agricultural workforces and specialized craftsmen and people like that. So they would go into the empire and get them. But in this phase, it seems that Khusro II is taking really to heart the idea that the Persian Empire should really extend to the Mediterranean, as it did in Achaemenid times, right? In ancient history, the empire that Alexander conquered. So it seems that the Sasanians, this is this dynasty, this Iranian dynasty that's ruling the Persian Empire. Of course, they were aware of the Achaemenids, but sometimes they would have these claims to reviving the former greatness of the Iranian Empire.
Sure.
So, bathing in the Mediterranean Sea is something that many Near Eastern monarchs, they did this as a sign of success. Anyway, for the Romans, it was sheer survival. Just desperate survival, because they knew that this was a war that could end the Roman state.
I mean, they're already on the verge of being ended.
Yeah.
And here they're defensive wars of survival.
Yeah. So it's pretty clear that initially the goal of Arab-Muslim warfare is to unify Arabia. That is, that all Arabs should be Muslim and should be unified into this religious kind of state, whatever, that the Prophet and his successors had created. Now, then they start striking out into Rome and into Iran. It's not entirely clear, why. Now, there are obvious reasons. I mean, it's not like a huge historical mystery why a recently formed successful army will decide to take on two very weak opponents who are on their doorstep. This is not complicated.
Yeah, they're pretty effective at military conquest.
Yeah, but they're striking both empires from a direction that those empires had never prepared to defend from. Arabia was just not Oh, you might get some occasional raiders. You're never going to get an army that's coming out that can potentially conquer you. So the defensive orientations are all wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And these two empires have gone through this massive war that has destabilized them. They're low on manpower, low on resources. The outcome is almost kind of inevitable. I don't think there's a great mystery.
And the effect of that is they stripped away the richest provinces of the Roman Empire.
Yes, Egypt in particular.
Mm-hmm.
That means now you can't feed Constantinople. Like we talked about the grain from Egypt, right, that came to Constantinople. You don't have that now. And so that means that the population of Constantinople will decline dramatically over the next few decades.
So how does the empire rebuild itself, restabilize? Because it doesn't collapse there, right?
Yes.
It survives. There's interesting low points for the empire where it still survives.
This is one of them.
And that is as interesting as the survival at the top and the flourishing survival at the bottom is also super interesting. So what happens? How does it kind of stabilize?
Very slowly. This is a painful process, and it takes them centuries, you could say.
Yeah.
First, you got to stop the bleeding. Just try to hold the line. It takes them decades to hold a line. Like they get pummeled by the Arabs for decades in the 7th century until finally by 670, they finally begin to beat them on land and hold the line on the sea. And so we now have an investment in fleets. Eventually you get the Greek fire, which is the flamethrowers. And when the Arabs try to take Constantinople, these attempts are defeated like twice. And that ensures the survival of the Roman state in some form.
How were the flamethrowers used?
Yes, this is an interesting question. We're still kind of debating that.
Oh, it's not fully understood.
Well, it's a state secret. They didn't want this getting out, so they kept it pretty well. The fact that we're debating it will tell you that they were pretty good at keeping secrets. So possibly through a pressure valve, right? So you have this flammable compound whose preparation and components is also a state secret. So there's there's a corps of engineers that prepares this and deploys it. And it's possibly through a heated, pressurized container with a spigot, let's say, that unleashes this thing through a nozzle, and it's lit and basically spews flaming napalm on other ships. And it will continue to burn even when it's on the water, right, on the top. So, like, you can't, like, swim away or anything. So it's this very, very destructive weapon. Terrifying. They used it against Vikings, too. This is much later. So once the Vikings show up, like when they would attacked Constantinople in the 940s, then again in the 1040s, the Romans used Greek fire fleets to just incinerate and that'll teach Vikings. Yes, if you're in that situation, you'd rather serve under the emperors than attack them.
And so this is a kind of nuclear weapon level state secret.
They even had it in hand grenade form.
This is a real thing?
Oh, yes.
Hand grenade form.
Yes. So it's like a clay container with the compound, and it has like some sort of fuse that you light on the outside and you throw it. Now, you can throw it against people, but it's not going to be that effective. Maybe you burn a person, whatever. You just wasted a hand grenade for one person. It's most effective against things like siege engines. So you throw that on a wooden frame and, yeah.
This is incredible. So this is one of the things that's finally stabilized, stopped the bleeding from a military perspective.
Yeah, eventually. Now remember, they've pulled the armies back into Asia Minor. So they're beginning to defend and fortify Asia Minor. Now you have to find ways to pay and support and feed all of these soldiers. And this is a whole it's a wrenching administrative readjustment. But they go through it. It takes them a long time. eventually they emerge with a different kind of strategic logistical system.
So it's a smaller, harder
Yeah.
core
Yeah.
of the empire.
That's right. Very militarized.